Hola and g'day. Welcome to International Sherry Week, or as it's been coined by TSA in Australia, International Palomino Week. My name is Chelsea Anthem, and yes, you hear right, I'm an Aussie. Joining you at 9 a.m. Sorry, we're at 9:06, but I am in Andalusia, so you know we always are a little bit late here, and I'm right here in Sherry Country. So as we wait for a few more guests to log on, if you haven't already done so, pour yourself a nice big glass of your preferred sherry. I've got mine here. Even I've got a Manzanilla Passata, even though it's only 9 a.m. You know, it's why I call sherry a health drink, and it is International Sherry Week. And why am I here talking to you about it? About 8 years ago, I moved to Spain on a mission to discover my father's country and get to know his family. I fell in love with Andalusia, and within the first month, I discovered Vinos de Jerez, also known as sherry. But like so many of us, I thought sherry was a sweet wine, or the wine that I'd nicked from the cupboard that had been open for who knows how long to get smashed on as a kid or actually as a teenager. So when I first discovered the real sherry, it blew my mind. It was bone dry Fino from El Puerto de Santa Maria. And it was this first sip that started my curiosity for discovering the wines. And as a marketer, it got me really intrigued as to what went wrong and why were there so many misconceptions, and not just in Australia, but worldwide, about this incredible drink that once upon a time was one of the most sold wines in the world. So my background isn't in wine, it's in marketing. And before I left Australia in 2009, I was working in marketing with a focus on digital. So when I started researching about sherry and going to all of the sherry bodegas, what I quickly realized was that there was like this cult of what I call sherry lovers all over the world. And this cult of people, they loved to talk about it. They really got it. They were passionate about it, like what I am now. But they had no way of connecting online because at that time there was next to no social media platforms or websites around sherry, or actually from the bodegas themselves. So I started International Sherry Week, which was a simple concept with the focus to give people that work in the wine trade or hospitality, from buyers, producers, sommeliers, chefs, educators, importers, a reason to talk about sherry and promote it during 1 week every year, thus creating a huge amount of noise, which is what we're doing right now. And this is how I met Scott Wasley. I recall actually him being one of the first people I randomly wrote to, who I'm sure he thought, what the hell is this Australian girl who knows nothing about sherry doing, trying to create International Sherry Week? But he responded immediately and went, I'm in. So here we are, 7 years later, and Sherry Week now we do around 2,500 events every year in the first week of November in 30 countries simultaneously. And this year, despite the difficult situation that many bars and restaurants are in, and the hospitality trade in general, we've made even more effort to support them in their passion and their work in promoting sherry and connecting with their customers by doing online events, which is why we're here right now. So this week we've got 1,152 registered events in 28 countries taking place. So hopefully now you've all got your sherry and you're almost ready for an amazing experience, because this event we're doing right now is a result of basically us thinking there's so many Zooms that we've got to do something that booms, you know, like how can we do something more than just a normal sherry online Zoom tasting? So I called Scott and I was like, listen, I've got this idea to do a 24-hour online World Sherry pairing dinner. Not non-stop, but 5 countries in 24 hours, and we start in Australia. What do you reckon? And he went, again, count on me. So here we are. All of the events are going to be streamed live on the Sherry Wines Facebook page. So after this morning, your evening, we go to China, then we go to London, then we go to Spain, and then we'll finish up in the USA. But enough of me talking, because it's time to bring in the real star of the show, Scott Wasley, who's going to take you on a journey of the Marco de Jerez. And Scott, as many of you may already know, is a pioneer in introducing Spanish wines to the Australian market. In fact, he celebrated with his company his 20th anniversary this September, and he's been importing sherry and Manzanilla to Australia for 18 years. So I think it's fair to say that he knows what he's talking about. But what I think is a real testament to his respect in the sherry industry is that he has managed to convince two very prestigious sherry houses to allow him to do his own limited bottlings. Now, this is super rare for this to happen here. So if you can get your hands on any of his wines, you know there's a lot of love and a deep story behind it. Hola, Scott. Where are you? Welcome.
Hola, guapa.
¿Qué tal?
Muy bien. Buena introducción. Gracias.
De nada.
Here are the two wines that Chelsea was talking about, a couple of manzanillas that I put together last year, which aren't really the topic of tonight, but certainly a nice topic in our lives at the moment.
Can I ask you before I go, because I'm going to go into the background and drink my sherry and pretend that I'm working. How did you go about actually, what was the process you went through to actually choose those sherries? Because there's so much to choose from. Like, what made you pick those particular suckers?
Okay, there were two different things that were correlated, and there were two different ideas in the aging of sherry, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. Firstly, this one just came upon me. This is actually a wine cellar right here in Pago Balbaina in the back of San Lucar, from the Blanco brothers of Bodegas Cayajuela, and they took me for a tasting through all of the Finos that they had in their cellar. Correction, all of the Palominos that they had in the cellar, which is going to be the actual conversation tonight. And we tried Palominos that were younger than Finos, with some development in the bodega, some stainless steel, just varietal Palominos. And then we got to all of the Finos that they make, which in this town are called manzanillas because they're in San Lucar, but they're all Finos. And we tried older Finos that have developed beyond the protection of the floor yeast that are called, in San Lucar, that are called manzanilla pasadas. So your first crazy Spanish thing about what happens in Marco de Jerez is that this style of wine, a Fino that's aged beyond the floor and is yet not showing any Amontillado character, in San Lucar is called a manzanilla pasada, or past manzanilla, but not yet Amontillado, and it's legal. In Jerez, 25 minutes away, it's called a Fino Amontillado, a hybrid in-between style. It's neither Fino nor Amontillado, and right now it's illegal to put into the market. So these guys, Paco and Pepe Blanco in Cayajuela, make a fantastic manzanilla pasada named after their father, called Blanquito. And they needed some more wine to feed Blanquito, which is a reasonably developed manzanilla pasada. So they'd taken a few barrels out of their manzanilla solera and were aging them topped up at 15%, not fortified, but without floor, and making them sort of the entry wine to a manzanilla pasada solera. And they showed it to me, and it was just a wine, an incredible moment. It had this water white, salt and wheat purity of a manzanilla, with a sort of beginning to oxidize, burnish, brassy rim of orange gold that hadn't penetrated the heart of the wine. And I said to the boys, has anybody seen this? Have you ever bottled it? It's amazing. This wine will never taste like this again. Could we maybe take a photograph and snapshot it and go, this thing now doesn't exist already, but we took a photo and there are a few magnums.
So you've got it in Australia and I can't taste it, and I'm in sherry country.
So this magnum
pretty
is staying in my cellar. When I put this down, it's going to have CA written on it, and it'll stay in my cellar until you're in Australia, and we'll drink a magnum of Manzanilla Passata.
Deal.
Conversely, the other wine that I made, I was actually much more involved in. I blended this. So this is
They let you blend it as well.
this is the sister Solera to La Goya, owned by the same company, Delgado Zaleta. My mate, and at the time then manager of the Spanish acquisition and the equal biggest Marco de Jerez nut in Australia, maybe the world, along with me, James Verco, said, Hefe, why the heck aren't you going to a bodega and doing some selections? All right. That's a very good question. So I rang the boss of Delgado Zaleta, and he said, sure, we got lots of barrels, whatever you want. So we went
Doesn't
in.
do that with everyone, huh? Like, you make it sound like, sure, no. It's because you've been importing for 18 years and you're deeply passionate about what you do and respect their wines.
Yeah, so this is my Manzanilla blend. It's more fino than Manzanilla. It's quite powerful, quite earthy. We bottled it in Rama. We launched it in Australia yesterday. If anybody's listening and they get in quick, we won't have sold out by the weekend maybe. So
wow.
It's in 500s and magnums. It's pretty good. Anyway, let's get on with the story.
Before I leave you, just for some, the housekeeping, as they say, the chat everyone's invited to chat away in the chat. If you have, between yourselves as the tasting goes on, if you have any specific questions, put them in the Q&A spot, and Nicola will do her best to answer them throughout the show. So salud, Scott. Salud to everyone in Australia and anyone around the world. I don't know when I'm going to get back, but you keep that magnum for me and take care, and feliz Palomino week. Ciao.
Cool. So, thank you, Chelsea. So Chelsea's beautiful personal project, which we've all shared in over a long period of time, and which has the full backing of the Consejo Regulador of Dio Jerez and Dio San Lucar, which is run by a really good friend of Chelsea's and mine, Cesar Saldana, has fully supported Chelsea's little thing, and it's now actually integrated in what the Dio does. The point of tonight, and in Australia, us calling this International Palomino Week rather than International Sherry Week, is not so much that we want to say we don't believe in sherry, as sherry just doesn't encapsulate what's going on in this beautiful place. So here you see the chalk soils of the typical Pago of Marco de Jerez. Pago is wine language for a cerro, which is a hill. So if you look here, there's a little hill in the foreground, and you can see how it goes from brown sand and clay up to bright white chalk, and that's only about 50 meters above the ground. When the chalk rises, that's where we can make really great wine. Palomino that tastes in 4 colors. Yellow for the wheaty cereal character, white, of course, for the chalk, but also the salt of the Atlantic, which impregnates all of this place. Blue, not just for the clear blue Andalusian sky, but for the wok scorch and nori wrapper, old marine seabed character that is conveyed by these chalk soils. And the last colour that these things taste in is orange for like the delicate citrus florals of mandarin and so on. There are a whole bunch of styles of wines in this place that are not protected by the word sherry, not promoted by the board of Dio Jerez, and therefore if we stay in the mindset of this place is sherry country, the sherry triangle, I really like sherry wines, we're kind of, if I can split screen myself in half, we're kind of segregating this region into what flies and what doesn't fly. And unfortunately, here behind the sealed screen, I'm not allowed to show you if I'm Dio Jerez, are many of the most beautiful and interesting wines made from Palomino grapes in the soils of this region. So Sherry, as it is officially known, just talks about a few things like Manzanilla, Fino, and Oloroso, and the only thing that they're concerned about in these namings is oxidative handling in the winery. So it's just like the nonsense we have in Rioja, where you have a DO trying to talk about wines being called Crianza, Reserva, Grand Reserva, and at the same time the village is illegal, terroir, the actual meaning of the place is illegal, and for many, many years that's been the story in this joint. In fact, the reason why we talk about Palomino now, the reason why we're calling it International Palomino Week, the reason why we've got this amazing collection of 30 or 40 world-class, Premier Cru, Grand Cru equivalent wines that we sell as Palomino in the Spanish acquisition, is that we had a significant moment. 3 years ago, James and I were talking. He'd said, "Hey, boss, somebody asked me for an updated copy of the sherry file, and I had a look at it, and it's kind of out of date." And it was January, and it was hot, and the cricket was on, and I went, "Yeah, you're right, mate, I haven't touched that for ages." So I stayed at home for a couple of weeks to rewrite the Spanish acquisitions sherry note file. And I went, it doesn't have any of this in it. It just talks about aging in a bodega. So it's, stuff about rules about oxygen and time and barrels and all of this sort of stuff, incredibly ungastronomic. And it doesn't convey the place. This is one of the most beautiful places in the world of wine. And yet all you're ever told is oxygen and time in barrel, some arcane stuff about what happens in the winery. And at the same time, a very dear friend of the Spanish acquisitions, Peter Sisseck, who's famous as the winemaker, owner of Dominio de Pingus in Ribera del Duero and several other extremely important projects in Spanish wine, and one of the most intelligent men in global wine, generally speaking, had just announced that he was going to Jerez, had gone to Jerez, and bought a tiny parcel in a Pago just off screen here, Balbaina Alta, just down the coast towards Puerto de Santa Maria. And he bought a tiny parcel or a little single vineyard or cru within this Pago. And he said, there'll be a time where there's a great Grand Cru equivalent white wine like, Le Montrachet or whatever, made in Spain, and when it is, it'll be a Fino, but it'll be a contemporary terroirist Fino that is based in a vineyard and try to express that vineyard. It's not going to be about whatever we do to it in the bodega. Peter bought this vineyard, and I'm rewriting this file, rehashing the usual line. The terroir of sherry is the air in the bodega. So a wine in San Lucar, close to the Atlantic and really salty and mild and humid and all that sort of thing, is going to be fresher and lighter and more lemony than something down the coast in Puerto, let alone something inland in Jerez, which is just completely to overlook these things, the vineyards, the chalks, and it was clear that it was time that somebody paid attention to that. So we've spent the last 3 years of our lives more or less obsessed with that, learning about that, trying to learn how to express it better, putting together our collection, and so on and so on. So what we want to do is go, at the moment, DO Jerez doesn't allow anything except a few narrowly defined old-fashioned sherry things, and there's some pretty corrupt or dodgy regulations in what is allowed. And at the same time, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's great that is just not allowed. So all of these other things, which we're going to talk about a lot tonight, as well as these things, all of these other things are just illegal. They have to find their way into the market as outlaws, shunned, ignored, banned by the Consejo Regulador. Let's have a little break from that. And Nicola, are you ready to roll with some vid? We're gonna take a little break and talk about some of what happens in Andalusia. You can. Nicola went down the coast today to talk to a chef and just make a classical Andalusian peasant food of the poor dish.
Yes, so I actually got a bit of time away from my desk today, which was lovely. And for any of our international viewers who aren't aware of this geolocation, it's a small town called Lawn, which is located on Australia's Great Ocean Road, which is about a 250-kilometre meandering, beautiful coastal road on the southern Victorian coast. And there are two reasons to go to Lawn. One of them is to surf, and the other reason is to go to Movida. Or in fact, there's a few other restaurants which are wonderful, but they're mine and Scotty's favourite reason to go. The surf, as you can see, was no good, so I headed to Movida Lawn to meet with the chef Kane Vacoon and see what was cooking. Here we go. I'm here at Movida Lawn with Chef Kane Vacoon. Now, what are you making here, Kane?
Today we're making a traditional Andalusian dish called ajo campero. So here I have all my ingredients that I need: blanched and diced tomatoes, sweet paprika, red and green peppers, garlic, and yesterday's bread.
Beautiful. So super simple ingredients. Now there's going to be a few people that are making this at home. Traditionally you would use a lebrija, which is a locally potted clay bowl, but perhaps you can suggest what people might use if they are making this at home.
Yep, so obviously not everyone has a lebrija at home, myself included. So today I'll be using a mortar and pestle, but if you don't have one of those at home, you could also use a bowl or a wok, spoon, or the back of a ladle.
Amazing. I'm so excited to try this. I've never tried it before. So perhaps you can show us the method and how you're going to put this all together.
Yeah, cool.
So I'm actually just going to correct myself here. I called it a lebrija, but it's actually lebrigo, and it comes traditionally from the town of Lebrija, which is the most northern town of Marco de Jerez before you reach Sevilla, basically. And here you can see that Kane is very, very gently smooshing, as per Scott's very technical terming in his recipe, which hopefully everyone has received. And if you haven't, please tell me. Scott has got a library of fantastic Spanish recipes that he's uncovered on the road. So here we go. Let's see.
Okay, to the mix. Just a ladle to a ladle and a half. And 2 ladles of the tomato water. So water I used to blanch the tomatoes in. It's been salted. Now we'll just cover it. Leave it to stand for 10 to 20 minutes, depending on how dense the bread is.
There we go. So we'll check back in on that in a little while and see what the finished product was like. Here at Movida.
Fantastic, thanks, Nick. So ajo campero, or the ajo, the garlic soup of the farm worker, this is what almost looked like an apocryphal tale 10, 20 years ago. You hear this story of poor farm workers going to walk out into the vineyards or the farm allotments, whatever, not necessarily just people working with grapes. And they put some stale bread and a tomato or something in their bag, and that was what they were going to eat for lunch. And they'd have an ajo, so mortar and pestle, in their farmer's hat, and they'd just grind up stale bread with almonds or tomatoes, whatever's in season, some olive oil, But it's true. This is how people. There's a lot of very, very poor people and workers in these places today, and it's also absolutely delicious. And it's bitter and rich and earthy and sweet and all of the things that gorgeous Palomino can be. So I just want to go back to the unmasking. The notion of sherry as a thing is a reasonably narrow palette of oxidatively aged, possibly protected by floor yeast, so managed oxidatively aged wines from Palomino, which are fantastic. Many of you have been harangued by me for many, many years about why these are the greatest drinks in the world. You should be doing lots of stuff with them. But we miss in that a bunch of other things, which are the broader palette of what Palomino can do. And we're going to show you some lovely faces in a minute. This is a region that's been in depression for 50 years, and part of it's a depression that's been kind of facilitated by the big companies and the board. And they've basically been living in a Groundhog Day where all they do is go, shit, man, all we can do is produce $2 cost of production bottles of Fino. Let's just flip that. We've now got people making Palominos that in Australia you're going to spend $165 retail to drink at home, or $350 on a wine list in a great restaurant, that will challenge, stare down, snake wrestle and walk off against the greatest of white burgundies or whatever. Just incredible white wines. The taste of the chalk white, the yellow Palomino wheatiness, the blue of the ocean and all of that sort of thing. These wines are just illegal still in this place. They're completely not supported. So Palomino, we like to express in a thing that we call the Palominos to Finos continuum, which is just all wines. One of the worst things about thinking about sherry is that it invites you to think about it as not wine. It's some weird little thing that you noodle away at in some stupid little cup like this and go, it's not wine. It goes in some aperitivo section in the front of your wine list or some other thing. Palomino with great viticulture makes wonderful, wonderful wine. So it can be just stainless steel white wine. It can make really nice method ancestral bubbles. It can make stainless steel table wine, in this instance with a little bit of the local PX in it. It can make an orange wine. And then there's a really interesting category of things that aren't legal, deliberately banned by the DO. And there's a really strong cohort of young producers who are making this, which is Palomino Vino de Pasto. Vino de Pasto just means wine that's had a little bit of aging, might have seen some floor, will have been in an old sherry cask or botta. But it's all about expressing the Pago, expressing the Albaritza, whether there's a fresh Poniente breeze or a hot inland Levante breeze. And then we get to the wealth of things that are possible in Finos. So Palomino, Vino de Pasto, and then Palomino expressed as Finos in all their possibilities. You know, I say this to most of you very often. I drink liqueur every day, always have done, always will do, ain't gonna change. Conventional, filtered, Solera blended, fortified Finos are wonderful drinks, and they're not weird things, they're just wine. You can drink them all the way through your meal. But there are many, many, many other possibilities. Cavarubia, for example, is a wine that broke the rules of the Consejo Regulador just 2 years ago. It's the first wine that broke down a bad rule that was put in 50 years ago that said that all Finos needed to be fortified, need to add alcohol. This wine is just made in the vineyard, so it's got its own natural alcohol, 15% that qualifies it as a Fino from a little bit of sun drying. It's also statically aged. It's not Solera blended. It's a few casks of vintage Fino from different vintages. And so on and so on. There are many more styles. So we're not saying that vintage wine is better or less good than another, that fortification is, you know, good, bad, or indifferent, just that the way that we understand these wines as sherry wines is an incredibly limited picture of what's going on. And the first and most abiding thing of it is that it stopped us for many years actually understanding the Pagos. What is the difference between Pago Machanudo, Pago Balbaina Alta, Miraflores Alta, etc. I'll stop just for a second. Nicola's going to show you some pics, which I'll talk over.
I'm just going to interrupt you there, Scott. Oh no, for a second. We've brought Peter Sisseck in as well. Good morning, Spanish time. Good evening.
Good morning. How are you?
How are you?
Hello, Peter.
Very well. Very well.
We're just Scott's about to get me sacked from the Consejo, but
Yeah.
I'm
Sounds
loving
like
it. So I'm going to let him keep free talking. So we're just going to show some pictures now. Nicola's got that, and then we'll cross back to you, Peter. So have you got a drink?
Yeah. I got my Viña Corrales, which is our news.
Well, hey.
Good man. Okay, so we'll come back to you in a second, and back to you, Scott.
Cool. So we'll quickly cross back to see how Nicola's Ajo ended up, and then we're just going to have a quick flick through some pics so that you can see what Marco de Jerez looks like, and then we're going to hunker down with Peter Sisseck and talk about his project.
Hey, Scotty, we've got these slides ready to go. So do you want to do it the other way around?
Bang them out.
Yeah, here we go. So on the screen, we've got a map of Marco de Jerez. So perhaps you can talk us through these images.
Cool. So quite simply, you're just seeing the Bay of Cadiz, the Atlantic, and probably the first thing that you need to really get your head around to break yourself out of the old way of looking at sherry, which was talking about the sherry triangle. Here you can see the 9 pueblos or villages of El Marco de Jerez, not just San Lucar, Puerto de Santa Maria and Jerez, but 6 others. And there's an important diversity of site, particularly if you realise that village appellations like Manzanilla, so to say a wine is a Manzanilla is to say that it comes from San Lucar de Barrameda, but it's quite common for somebody to be able to, and to do, buy their fruit from Trebujena or other villages outside of San Lucar. So here's the courtyard of Peter's Bodega San Francisco, one of the most beautiful places in wine. Here's a Pago Maina looking towards San Lucar and the Atlantic coast. This is Pago Atalaya looking inland from the Atlantic a little bit. You can see the chalk there very clearly. Don't click past that image, Nick. No. Here's a really good summation of how Marco de Jerez looks. We're on the top of the hill here in this vineyard. It's probably 70, 75 meters above sea level. And you can see when you cast your eye forward to San Lucar there, the land drops down 15 or 20 meters and it's not chalk anymore. You're starting to see brown dirt clay, sand, and all of that sort of thing. So the rise and fall of the landfall here is incredibly important in terms of finding the soil that maybe you want for fine phenos. Here's a nice pic. This is actually down south in Chiclana, where Primi Collientes works, and a nice pic of just how deep and pure white the chalk is, with a little bit of richness in and under, and some limestones and things. And here's a photo of some of the rebels who are changing the scene here. Obviously, Peter Sisseck would be in this picture if he had been at the time, and there's a couple of others missing, but here's Willie Perez, the Blanco brothers, Armando Guerrero, Ale from Forlong and Primi, and of course Willie's great friend and partner from San Lucar. A bunch of the people who've just gone, basically, screw you, we're not going to sit here and take this, we're not going to make $2 Finos anymore, we're going to roll the dice on being able to make great wine here. So Peter, who we're going to start talking to properly in just a few seconds, is a massive part of the conversation with these guys, who are all completely just going, let's bust out of this and let's believe that Palomino can be great, that our vineyards and soils can be great, and if we stop making cheap industrial Fino with higher crops and all of that sort of thing, that a whole lot of interesting stuff can happen. So let's stop talking about what I think and ask one of the experts on the scene. Hello, Mr. Sisseck. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, and yourself?
I'm great. I've got a nice glass of Fino, and while I have to wait to actually get Viña Corrales, can you put a bottle up on screen, because I don't.
You see it here?
Yeah, fantastic. So I told the guys at the start of the Zoom that the whole obsession we've got with Marco de Jerez started with when you told me that you'd bought a vineyard and you wanted to make, Grand Cru equivalent white wine down here. So tell us your story, sir.
Well, I mean, as you know, maybe the listeners don't know, is that I'm born in Denmark, and I came to Spain 30 years ago to work in a red wine district called Ribera del Duero. But getting to know Spain, one of the first places I went to was of course Jerez and the whole region down there, which I think it's fair to say is the most famous and if not original vineyard area of Spain, for better for worse, basically. So I remember when I was visiting in the area, a lot of people I spoke to very early on, even my first visits down there, I asked them why they didn't make vineyard designated Finos. Coming from a background of liking wines from great sites and all that, I thought it was an interesting question. And all the great enologists and wine guys down there said, no, Peter, the process, the aging under the floor will erase all kind of trace of origin and all that. And to me, that even 30 years ago sounded as a really good excuse just for producing something boring and bland and in volume, no? So and basically also when you look onto it, I mean, coming and being the same arguments that our great cousins from Champagne would also claim and say in order to produce something bland and not very interesting, was that the technology and the process is much more important than the origin. So it stayed with me for many, many years, this idea. And as I got to learn more and more about Jerez and all that, a couple of years ago, I got seriously interested and I think it was 2015 or 16. I said, well, let's try to buy something down there. And so the whole idea was that we were going to do only Fino. So we needed to find a Fino cellar, which is, as you might know, many different kind of wines are being made in Jerez, but I still consider the Fino, even though historically it's not the most ancient wine, it is a wine that, if you read all the old guys, the English guys who travel there, and all the pummies, as you call them, would write back and say, well, all these wines are great, whatever, but what was really interesting in this pale one that they drink themselves, being aged under the floor, and so biologically it's a wine that is active. It's still not, and I guess 200 years ago to bottle a wine like that, and not coming up with something ridiculously volatile and not pleasant, must have been complicated. So it was something that was just consumed in the taverns down in especially in San Luca and all that. But I do believe that it is the most original white wine of Spain. And why I call it white wine is, I think it's important, is that we should, and Scott was saying it just before, is that we should not look at it as an aperitif. We should look at it as great wines. And the greatest of the wines historically came, if they had a mention, they would probably be mentioned as Pagos. And Scott was also talking about the Pagos. And the Pagos are interesting because they are the first vineyard classification of land in Spain, and even in Europe, because it's quite old, the classification of the Pagos in itself. What few people seem to realize is that within the Pagos, you can say the Pagos are basically like vineyard land around a commune in Burgundy, a small village, because often they're quite big. I mean, the Balbainas, where we have a vineyard, Viña Corrales, it used to be 1,200 hectares, so it's huge. Machanudo, which is the famous Dumeco vineyard, very famous for Amontillados, is right now currently 300 hectares. So they're big areas. So just by using the Pago destination, which is already interesting enough, and it's a differentiation from just the blending of everything, is good. But I think we should go down to the vineyard level, and because within the Pagos, you would see on the old maps that there were vineyards. Like you would go to Burgundy, you would see within the villages, all the small vineyards that you had around in the village were all called vineyard names. I mean, La Tache and La Grand Cru, and we all know that. So why not use that for trying to regenerate interest in the wines from Jerez? So in order to do that, I mean, there are two ways of doing it. You start harvesting your grapes, you put them into barrel, you leave them half empty, so the floor will start growing on top. And then you top it up with fresh wine, you take some out and you do that for say 10, 15, 20 years, and you will have a fantastic Solera. And you spend a lot of dollars and a lot of bucks on doing that, and 20 years you haven't been able to sell anything. So that was a very right way of doing it, and would of course make a very pure thing. The other thing is to actually try to find something that will suit you and the style of one that you want to do. And we were lucky. When I say lucky, we were lucky is that I worked with a family that are good friends of mine. We own 50-50 of this project. They helped me find the place. They're from that region, and I invited them when they asked if they could be part of the project. When we have found it and we found the winery, I said, yeah, but if we have to do this in a proper way, we need to be 50-50. So we cannot you cannot sit on the fence and see me driving into the wall. And you have to be active in this. So we're 50-50. That's the way of doing it. So the Del Rio family are doing a lot of stuff. I can tell you even today, right now, in this very, very moment, we are actually bottling our second saca of the Viña Corrales at this very moment. So it's quite interesting. We were, so let me come back to it. So we bought 8 hectares in Balbainas, it's called Balbaina Baja because it belongs to the commune of Puerto Santa Maria, but it's very, very high up on the hill. It's 93 meters, and it's one of the highest vineyards in the region, overlooking the sea. It's next to a very famous vineyard called Los Cuadrados, which is one of the famous ones in Balbaina. Balbaina has historically always been known for making the finest wines for Fino. Looking around in order to find a cellar, we were able to find a cellar, old traditional almacenista, which is stockholders, the old stockholders. It used to be that the shippers that we know now today, Gonzalez Villas, whatever they're called, they actually used to be shippers. They were not just vignerons or vineyard owners, or they would blend different wines, and they would go around to all the stockholders in town, in Sanlúcar, in Jerez, or even down in Puerto Santa Maria, and they would select a bit like you would do with a whiskey. When they do the blended whiskey, and they would sort of do their blends of Tío Pepe, La Ina, and all that. But they didn't carry, normally they wouldn't carry a lot of stock. The stockholders were the almacenistas, and we were able to buy one of very famous almacenista called Ángel Zamorano. He had been the president of the Stockholders Association and all that. So. And he had given up his cellar. He created that cellar in the 60s, only to create Fino, which is quite unusual. People would normally also have Amontillado. I mean, the Amontillado is the natural prolongation of when the Fino goes wrong or it gets too old, it will turn into Amontillado. And then you would have, of course, from the pressings, you would get the rayas, they're called in Spanish, which are the second press, normally a bit more heavy wines, a bit more sugary and all that. And that would normally be turned into oloroso, that is just being aged in a oxidated way, with like any white wine basically on top of barrels, but of course being fortified. But the really interesting thing is the finest presses, all the lightest musts, all that will go eventually passing, in our case, through 2 years of as sobre tabla, they are called, meaning that they are lightly fortified. And we can get into that later on because you have been talking about this fortification, which is one of the issues that sort of takes the Fino away from just a normal white wine. And of course, there are ways of getting around that. And there's now a new president in the Consejo Regulador and a new government body there. So let's see if they're not open for more ideas of doing things in a different way. But I think we should not be too afraid of in itself of the alcohol that is being added. It's more what alcohol we add, where it comes from, and what to do with it and when. Because it is quite important when you do the aging on the floor that you have this high alcohol. It is extremely important because of the heat in our region. The floor, of course, is different kind of yeast that grows on top of the wine. But if the alcohol is too low, it's very prone to have bacterial attacks, and it will completely kill off the floor. So if you age low alcohol, you can do that in Jura, in France, where it's very cold, so this bacterial attack doesn't happen. But in our case, it does happen if we do not have this alcohol. So it's not so easy just to say that we don't want to fortify, we don't want to do this, we have to see about it. But as I say, I think it's much more interesting to find a way of, I mean, ideally you should make your own alcohol from your vineyards, and it shouldn't be neutralized alcohol as being used today, which is alcohol at 96 degrees. So it's tripled, or I don't know how many times it's being distilled. So officially it is sort of a neutral alcohol. Such a thing does not exist because there will always be traces of where it comes from. So it would be much more interesting if you had to add a bit of alcohol. I mean, we talk about 1 degree, so it's not, we're not talking about, I mean, it can be more, but if you grow your grapes in a proper way, you get 13 and a half degrees in your wine. We talk about 1 or 1.5 degrees of alcohol that you have to add to it. It is a dilution in a way. So if you could take the grapes from your own vineyard, distill that, or even the presses, and you can distill that, you would have your own wine. And so instead of using the neutralized alcohol, you can do what they use for making brandy, which is the Hollanda, and of course is lesser purified and therefore carries more of the vineyard trace. So that, I think, could be a very interesting way of coming around this issue. And then, of course, we have also right now, when you do this aging of the wines, in our case for the Viña Corrales, the average age of the wine in the Solera system would be 8 to 9 years old, and so it's incredibly old wine, and it's very prone to oxygen. It's very stable wine. Over the time, the yeast will consume part of the alcohol. So in the younger stages of the Solera system, you would have to contain the alcohol by small additions. Once you get into the Solera, where in our case we harvest once a year, in normal conditions we would harvest once a year. It could very well be that the alcohol level the day you're going to bottle will be below 15 alcohol, which is what you're allowed to bottle the wine with for the Consejo Regulador. If you have 14.8 in a perfectly sound Solera, I think you should be allowed to bottle that with that natural degree. You should not be forced to fortify that up to 15, which is just a stupid number that they have found out. But as long as you have a sound Solera system, where the wine hasn't been attacked by bacteria, then after you've taken the wine out and you will replenish the barrel, or the bota as we call it, you can then take the alcohol up to 15 again, and then you wait for a whole year until it drops down again below the 15, and then you can bottle. These are the things that I'm going to work for in the future, because I think there's a mismanagement of old tradition, and people are sticking to a system that is too rigid. I think we should think about much more about the quality of the wine than we should think about numbers in itself. But we must also understand that the 15 alcohol that you are forced to use in the old days used to be 16. So they have already dropped something. But below 15, most studies that I've read about and I've studied myself show that around 15 is a good alcohol percentage to avoid having bacteria attacks. It's not just because people are obsessed with having high alcohol in the wine. It is actually also to protect it. So, especially for the Soleras that are over many, many years. If you do, as some of my friends, Willie Perez and the young guys are doing vintage designated Finos, where they have 1 year, 2 years. Of course, here the alcohol percentage is much less important. But if you have a Solera like ours that have at an average age of 8 to 9 years old, it's important that we do not destroy. I mean, we have so much accumulated history in these barrels. If we screw it up, I mean, it's irreplaceable. We have to turn it all into Amontillado, so that would be horrible.
Peter, can I interrupt? That was incredible. What's great is that we've actually recorded it so we can go back and listen again, because that was so much information. We've got a lot of questions coming in. Is it okay if we ask you a few questions? One being, when are they going to be available in Europe, Spain and Australia?
Yeah. So first of all, Scott has very generously offered to import our wines to Australia. So he will get part of the second Saka that we're just bottling right now. So as soon as we have them labeled, and we will probably the end of we have to hand label. So it's a bit, but probably we'll be able to ship the end of November. So
great timing for Australian summer, because they'll get to Australia around January.
I don't know exactly how Scott is going to import them, or if they're by boat or whatever. I hope you use reefers, of course, cold.
Yes.
Yeah.
We transport in reefer trucks, reefer boats, reefer everything. Hey, I just wanted to ask one question, Peter. What do you think, so in the conversation between regular fortification with rectified spirit from La Mancha, or perhaps more characterful local spirit, what do you think about the third option, which is the soleo, or a little bit of sun drying to raise natural alcohol without actually fortifying?
Yeah. Again, I would. It's a very good question, and what I'm slightly against the Solera way of doing it is that it takes the freshness away. If you make wine, we did that last year. We did an experiment where we did 2 days of Solera, and we made the wine of it. And for me, it lacks freshness. It becomes sort of a bit more racy in character. That for me doesn't really fit what we would like. But it can also be a combination. You know, it's. I mean, the same thing goes for. I mean, on a regular basis, even in Bordeaux, where I also work. I'm able to get in Merlot and Cabernet Franc 15% potential alcohol in our grapes. I mean, it seems to be almost an unavoidable problem that we have now in many places, also in Ribera for our Tinto del Pais. And I was pretty cocky about in the beginning that, you know, knowing that everybody has 10 to 12 tons per hectare in Jerez, in the vineyards. I said, well, we just drop the fruit to half of that, and then we'll get the alcohol up. And I've seen that now we've done harvest for the last 3 years, and it's not so mathematical. It's not so easy. So it seems to be that in order to get much more than 13 degrees alcohol in the Balbaina vineyard, it is really complicated. Even if you have very low yields, we had 5,500 kilos per hectare this year. And we got barely 13 degrees alcohol. It was difficult to ripen this year. The Machanudo, where we also have a small vineyard, because the idea is we take it so seriously what we're doing, in the sense that we are going to, in a couple of years' time, we're now preparing a second Solera, just with wine from our Machanudo. This is laid down with wine from our vineyard. So it will take these 10, 15 years, really, maybe a bit shorter, to get the Solera going. But I always wanted to be able to present to Fino, so people can really see that, you know, the process is not invading the origin, which is my thesis, no? And today, if you taste the two Soleras, I mean, they are so distinct, they're so different, that it just proves that, you know, what I always had the intuition is perfectly sound and right. If you have great cues, you have great, that seem also to be a selection according to what vineyard you're using, the selection of, you would normally have 4 different yeast that can produce the floor yeast. And the way that these are selected, how the blend of these yeast is very vineyard specific. So if you do the work in the vineyard in the proper way, all our grapes are done biodynamically. So we really encourage the grapes to have the natural flora from the vineyard. We don't, of course, we don't spray funny stuff on it and all that. And so we really respect that. It will take a long time because a lot of these vineyards in the Marco are really beaten up by years of abuse of herbicides and all kinds of rot is a big issue in our area. So a lot of anti-rot sprays have been used. And as you know, the yeast is a rot, it's a fungi. So if you've been spraying for the last 20 years anti-rot, you can imagine the state of the fungi in the vineyard right now. It's really low. So this is going to, as it has been in so many other areas where I've been working, it will be a steady work for the next 10 years in order to recover microbiological life in the soil, in the vineyard, all that, and of course in the cellar.
Taking into account everything that you've just said, we've had a really interesting question here from James Burko, who is a dear friend of ours and was formerly TSA's second in command. And he's basically asked, what is it that typifies the wines that are currently made from your vineyards?
Wait, sorry, can you repeat that?
So what is it that typifies the wines that are made from your vineyards? What is it that is sort of the go-to tell for your wines? Do you think?
I mean, I'm not sure I really understand the question. I mean, what type of wine is it we're making? We're making a basic white wine. It's made like any white wine in the world today.
I think the question basically is, how do you feel as though, what is it from the vineyards that translates into your wines?
Okay, so I mean, here coming from two different sites where the Balbaina vineyard is a high vineyard overlooking the sea, has a lot of influence from the sea. It has a beautiful albaritza, Barajuela, which is a special kind of layered limestone, makes for really racy wines. I mean, they're fantastically fine and pure and elegant. The Machanudo, which is a much more inland vineyard. What's interesting this year is that we have the same degrees alcohol, almost 13 degrees alcohol in the natural wine before it's been fortified. We will not fortify until March. The energy of the Machanudo, the dry extract, is totally different. But even though that analytically the two wines are very similar when you look at them in the lab, but when you taste it, they're just two totally different animals. I mean, where the elegance and the almost feminine style of the Balbaina and this much more masculine-driven, energetic wine from Machanudo. So it's really interesting to see how different they are. This is due to the land and due to the location, because the Machanudo is much more inland, so it's a warmer vineyard. But because it's warmer doesn't mean that it ripens more. It's just ripens in a way. So it's very interesting, the two differences, and we can see a clear change also in when we get the aging of the wine in the barrel under the floor. There are much more evidence of the Beticus, which is one of the four I spoke about, that tends to give a much more smoky, sort of Meursault-ish touch to the wine. It's much more predominant in the barrels of the Machanudo than they are in Balbainas. The Balbainas is much more the Montoyense yeast, which is the kind of yeast that you would prevailing in say Tio Pepe in Rama is 100% Montoyense normally. So we 75% of that.
The yeast question is something that I wanted to ask you to elaborate on somewhat. One of the most interesting wine chats I've ever had was with you in Ribera del Duero with Todd Slater, who's in the chat tonight, and you were talking about Brettanomyces and various other things, and how yeast translate from the vineyard and how they vary from year to year. And it's, you know, something as a wine scientist that you're particularly intelligent about. I'm really interested to know what your take on yeast is going down to Marco de Jerez. I was stunned the first time I was in Bodega San Francisco, and your capataz showed me 2 barrels side by side, took a photo with my iPhone in the top of one, which was pure dark Beticus, and next to it, a barrel right next to it that's been co-blended for years, light, creamy Montulliensis, side by side. Particularly now that you're going to be much more viticulturally driven, do you see yourself as a vineyard, as a yeast manager? Do you understand that you're going to farm and work yeast, or are you just going to take what you get?
Yeah, again, it's an interesting question, because when we took over the cellar in 17, even though that Ramiro, who's a great friend of Willie Perez, he was the consultant guy at the winery at that time, and he'd done a marvelous job of separating and identifying the different barrels and stuff. So we've been able to do the selection of 74 barrels that he selected in the old days, and this is our Solera now for Viña Corrales. So let's just say that they were not all in the whole system, were not all perfect. So some of them was lacking the floor, and we had to sort of recreate the floor on some of the barrels, especially some of the higher ones. And so, of course, we had to make a choice of what yeast would we inoculate with, because you take from other barrels. So we had the choice, no? So I said, okay, let's respect sort of the 75-25 Montulliensis Beticus. What was interesting is that when we tried to do that, we could see that even we were creating the growth, but if we did not respect the barrel, you cannot change the yeast. I mean, the yeast, because of the lees that you have, the capezuela, it's called in Spanish, is so predominant. So even that you can have a barrel without very active growing Montulliensis, for example, if you want to turn it into Beticus, the lease will not allow you to do that. So you have to respect the barrel itself. So over the years, I'm sure, because what we're going to do and what we're doing right now is we're of course fermenting with wild yeast, as you would do any other place if you're not from Roseworthy or some of your more technological driven wine schools in Australia and other places. So we would like to respect the original yeast, so we will see over time what is, because of course this is thing that we're adding from the same vineyard over time. You will have to see that over the next 5 to 10 years, how it's going to affect really what we have. So it is an open question, but in my naivety in the beginning, I thought you could direct it more. You cannot. You have to respect what is actually from each barrel. Is what I'm seeing right now.
Peter, I'm going to just ask you another question from our audience. So this question is from Peter Rogers, another very dear friend of ours, who's actually a distributor in Queensland. And he's basically asked, you know, you've got a lot of invested interest in other projects in Champagne, Burgundy, Barolo. What is it about Marco de Jerez? Why is your heart so driven to this area? Is it anything specifically that you can pinpoint? Is it about the site? Is it about this floor engagement? You know, you speak with so much passion, but can you put it into a few words? What it is about Marco that really intrigues you?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, I think without any doubt, and I think most people would agree with me, that the most known wine from Spain is sherry. Unfortunately, they have been so good at promoting the name sherry, and as it is a sack with a lot of things inside, it tends to confuse more than it helps. But if you go anywhere all over the world, and if you say the name sherry, most people will think of it as a type of wine that probably is more closely related to cream, which is this half-sweet oloroso thing. But a lot of people would know it. So also the historic background of Jerez, I think it's unique, not just in Spain, but certainly in the wine world. It was one of the really famous wines 200-300 years ago. Shakespeare wrote about it. You know, I mean, it is historically unbeatable in Spain. It was, when I really was very drawn to it, I was fighting for having a zonal vineyard classification in Ribera del Duero, which is where I normally make my wine. And I couldn't get my stone-headed colleagues here in this region to accept this. And knowing that one of the oldest vineyard classifications in the world is from Jerez, I said, fuck, if I cannot do it in Ribera, I will go to Jerez and I will revive this vineyard classification. No? So that, and then of course, I've always been interested in the my uncle was a big yeast guy, known in Bordeaux for doing a lot with yeast. He was the inventor with Brian Crozer of the famous R2 yeast. So yeast has always been something for me, and working in we're biodynamically certified here in Ribera. The whole idea, the way that we work the soil with compost and with especially the 500 with the cow shit in the horn and all that, you know, the voodoo stuff that we do, is actually stimulate the microbiological life of the soils. And this is one of the most evident things when you come to Jerez. You see how these soils are so beaten up with such a long time of mismanagement that you really want to get your hands into it and help them. I mean, like defensive kids, you really want to protect them. And so, yeah, I just love the place. I love the idea of the canals, and it's fantastic. And you know, aesthetically, I also like it. And then Jerez is a fantastic town. I mean, it's just fun to be there. It's full of flamingo, and it's almost kitschy Spain. I mean, it's wonderful. I love it. Maybe it was too long, but you know, I tried to.
You have so much passion. I'm going to pass over to Scott now. I think he might have a few last words to discuss. Scotty?
Yeah, cool. So Peter, most of the people in the Zoom know that I visited Bodega San Francisco and Corrales the last couple of years trying to catch up with what you've been doing. But I haven't actually told anything about what you've been doing to get to the point where you were ready to release Corrales. I wanted to leave that to be your story. So the interesting thing, maybe as a sign out, so you've inherited and managed a really beautiful, significant Solera of more or less 10-year-old Fino, and you've done some management and weeding out of that. But in the last couple of years, you've done a couple of interesting things, jumping the thing that I came asking from the get-go was, so if you've got this long cycle thing, and you know, 8-9-year-old average age Fino that's been blended for a long time, you know, beautifully managed by Ramiro for a while, but you want to do your thing, and if you just put young wine or Sobretables in the front, when and how does it actually become Peter Sisseck wine? And you did a really interesting thing in the last couple of years with young wine jumping almost to the Solera, as I understand. Can you tell what you've done with young wine entering where you would expect it, and also down towards the mature end?
Yeah. Okay, so when we bought the bodega, they had two Solera systems there already. Basically, they had one that Ramiro had selected at 74 barrels of the older part of the cellar, and then they had the other part that was still being used as a almacenista. So they were selling wine in bulk without to other sellers. So tasting and knowing that we had which is the very most important part of the Fino barrel, is the Cabezuela, because this is something you can only gain over time, and it's hugely overlooked, I think. The importance of because you have almost philosophically, you can say, this wonderful wine that is being aged between the life, which is on top, and death, which is underneath in the lees. So you have this wine that is being aged between life and death. It's really, really interesting. And of course, the yeast on top will eat not just alcohol, but also the acetic acid, plus the glycerol. And the glycerol, as people who know about wine, is what gives you sort of volume in the mouth and sort of that sweet taste and all that. So when you have a wine that is being consumed by very active yeast on top, it will have basically zero glycerol. So it becomes this very bony, skeletal wine. You can taste that in a lot of Amontillado. So they're so bone dry, they almost pull your teeth out. And if you do not have the lees, that will sort of coat, if you can get it. This thing, it will not be a very interesting one. And so you see a lot of the younger Soleras are basically bone dry wines, but with very little mouthfeel. And one of the great things about any great white wine in the world, basically the Burgundies and stuff, Chenin Blancs also, is that they have great texture. They become very vinous. No? So you can also see it in great Champagne. Jacques Celos's wines are also always with a great texture and mouthfeel. And this is what this Solera gives us, because we have such a large amount of Cabezuela. So we get this wonderful texture of the wine. So the Solera was arranged in the old days in Solera, first and second criadera, which is what we call it, first and second aging stages. No? Knowing that we had a lot of other barrels outside that were being used for, we rearranged the cellar in the way that we now have third level, fourth, and fifth. The fifth and the fourth level is where we will age the sobre tabla. The sobre tabla is the young wine that is being fermented this year, will be turned into sobre tabla, is when you add the alcohol, normally in March, historically in March. We'll probably do it slightly early in January, something like that. And we'll then enter into the system in the fifth level. The fifth will drop down into the fourth. And the fourth will drop and be blended with the third level. So we still respect that the second, first, and Solera are that, but we have added a pivotal barrel, if we call it that, which is the third level. And so this level, of course, we have a higher percentage of our own. We have now made 3 wines, 3 vintages. And the first year, knowing that I took a decision, the first 2 years, we're not going to bottle, I said. So we can mess around with this without losing the quality of it, and doing false sacas, as we call it. And then, so we did already the first year, we baptized, I call it. We added a bit of sort of symbolic droplets of young wine into the Solera. So it sort of became ours. We know, of course, and I said, I initiated this, that in order to do vineyard designated, 100% vineyard designated, you must start with your own Solera, and it will take you 15 or 20 years until you reach. So we didn't have time and money for that. So we have sort of baptized it with our own young wine, knowing that we're going to age it for 2 years. So we have maintained, the moment we start selling, we maintained the average age. but it has now symbolically a part of our own vineyard. Over the years and over time, of course, it will become more and more our own wine. This is for sure. But right now we're in this transitional period. The Machanudo, that is called Viña Cruz, that will be available in, say, 5-6 years. That will be 100% from our own vineyard.
How exciting!
As well as from the old vineyards. So.
One more abstract question, Peter. On my first visit there, I tasted a botta that had been, you'd been there a few weeks before me, but weren't there, but there was a barrel that had just sort of transitioned out of Fino and was just starting to get a little bit brassy, and you'd classified it apart as botta no.
Yeah.
It was just one botta, and I very cheekily, I knew I couldn't afford it, but I asked Senor Carlos if I could buy the thing. It was so beautiful. It was this Fino that had just got a little brassy Amontillado ring around it without actually changing from being Fino. And Peter had it classified apart. What happened to that botta? Is it still there, or
we maintain it? It's a very interesting barrel because it is by natural concentration. It is 16 alcohol. We haven't added extra alcohol to it, so it's actually by. But what's interesting, and normally they would say in the ancient times, they would say that over 16, the yeast will die away, so you cannot age it longer. So this is what happens to Varios Soleras. They will concentrate in alcohol so much that the yeast, they will die off, and they automatically becomes Amontillados, no? So you will add more alcohol up to 18, for example. Or if you do it in the natural way, it will sort of concentrate up to 18, and you will top up the barrel, and that's basically it. And you will start an oxidative. So this barrel that we called No, because it was marked No out of the Solera system, so we wouldn't use it for blending, because it did have, as you said rightly so, had this beginning of Amontillado. In the old days, there was a wine category in Ribera, in Jerez, that was called Fino Amontillado. That were wines that were on its process to become Amontillados. They're very, very interesting, very complex wines. We have a second barrel, because in order to maintain this barrel, we need to have its own sort of criadera. So we have a criadera for it also. So we have, in order to maintain it, but we can only, perhaps without downsizing the barrel and losing all what's right about it, we can probably only take around, say, 10 liters out a year. So it will always be something that will be extremely limited, and it will probably be something that we will give as a gift out of the more than it will be something available, but because it was maybe 10, 15 bottles a year. So it will be ridiculous. So we'll probably just consume it in the cellar among our friends and stuff like that, and it will be more
heartbreakingly beautiful wine, though.
Yeah. I mean, beauty comes with, it's normally very scarce. It's not very democratic.
So just speaking to the audience, the first sake that's available of Fino Viña Corrales for us is just 96 bottles. They'll arrive in February. They're available for pre-order. They're not incredibly expensive for the quality of the thing. I haven't tried the final sake of Corrales, but I've spent a lot of time in Bodega San Francisco in the last couple of years and tasted lots of barrels and things. You should be really, really confident that this is something that's going to completely change in context with things like Cabarrubia, a couple of Barracuela, and a couple of things that we've tried to show you in the last couple of years. A completely, let's not say different, a really evolutionary, expansionary, textural wine-like take on what Finos are about, which is the whole story that James, Nicola, and I have been trying to tell for the last couple of years. And Corrales, when you get the chance, will be, you know, a significant stepping stone in that story.
I hope we can add our small grain of sand to this continuous story, beautiful story with its ups and downs and crises and glorious moments and all that. I think most of us in Jerez are aware of the fact that, first of all, we have to maintain a large vineyard. A lot of people live off the vineyards. They are viticulture selling their grapes or their must to the larger corporations in Jerez. With the current prices that most of these finos are being sold for, it is very difficult for everybody to make a sound living of it. So it is something that is of utmost importance. It is try to higher the standard of what we're doing. I'm not saying that the wines that are being produced right now, I mean, they are of impeccable technical knowledge. I mean, to produce a Tio Pepe, 2 million bottles of that, of the quality that it is, and selling it for now in Spain for under €6 a bottle. I mean, it's almost a steal, and I don't think you can find anywhere in the wine world such a fantastic quality price relation as that. It's almost a steal, and it is complicated because it's not sustainable in time. This economically is not sustainable.
So can we just, because a lot of the people in the chat don't have access to this information. In Jerez last year, the top price for fruit below the 11.5 kilogram threshold was something like 54 euro cents per kilo. How does that compare to the just co-op price in Ribera del Duero or Rioja, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we've just been through, I think the lowest price that was offered in Ribera this year was 80 euro cents in Ribera for red grapes. It is true that you can harvest more kilos per hectare in Jerez. That does compensate a bit. We can only harvest 7,000 kilos here, or 7 tons per hectare. So that is a compensation. It's not one-to-one because you can harvest up to 12,000 kilos in Jerez legally. But again, it is not. And you know, the problem is in Jerez, it's also environmentally. I mean, the vineyards represent something you can grow there. It's not so that not so many other things you can grow there with a good result. They're now trying to plant olives and almonds and stuff like that. But I mean, this is historic vineyard ground. Why not try to maintain and try to sell something that's really interesting? But so the idea of this Viña Corrales, and we've tried to help consumers understand that this is a white wine. It is not just an aperitif. So we have bottled it into knowingly that, you know, that this is a Burgundy bottle. It looks like a Burgundy bottle. It's not because we want to imitate Burgundy wine, but we want people to understand that this is the white wine. And I do consider this to be the greatest white wine of Spain. It has a different taste, but it should give you the same feeling of complexity and textures and vinosity that a great white wine will do. And unfortunately, we do have a lot of white wine being produced in Spain, but it's often of very bland quality. It's not very interesting. There are some, fortunately now, good people making in Galicia, up in the northern part of the greener part and cooler part of Spain, they're making some delicious white wines. But again, volume is often being dominating and falls into the category of supermarket wines that of course you in Australia also know a lot about. So let's take the greatest white wine of Spain and try to make something great out of it. And I think right now, the Marco de Jerez with the young guys who are there, all these young kids all pushing the envelope. I really think it's the most interesting vineyard area in the world. So that is my take on it.
100%. Right, Peter, we're going to sort of sign off and say thank you. I'm just going to, it's going to be off my iPhone and not terribly interesting, but just as we say goodbye, I'm going to play, put some noise on in the background from an Australian dude, which is a memory of the first time that I met Peter Sisseck. My friend Peter Healy is in the chat tonight, and when I met Peter, I'd never met him before. Telmo said, "Oh, we're going to lunch with this guy Peter tomorrow. Where's what scuzzy student flat are you guys staying in Santa Ana?" All right, you walk down to that end of the street, and there'll be a guy there waiting to pick you up. I had no idea that it was Peter Sisseck. I walked out, and there's this big fat ass yellow Volvo with a window wound down, and Nick came blaring out of the window, and we went, okay, I guess that's our guy. That's 20 years. That's 20 years and 1 month ago, amigo.
Yeah, that's a long time ago. Almost a lifetime.
See you in Spain next year, hopefully. Who knows? Good luck with Corrales. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Animo.
Take care. Take care out there.
Come on.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.